Guy, it's really good to talk to you. Thanks for being at ATO 2022. You've been here, I think, all 10 years, if memory serves.
Yeah, I have.
So that's a feat in and of itself, and that's to be commended, but we thank you for that.
Yeah.
So let me ask you a little, I know you sat in on the keynotes this morning, and we had a very brief discussion that followed the keynotes about standards.
Right.
Because standards applies really to every topic that was discussed earlier today,
right.
and it certainly will moving forward. So for people listening, tell us about the importance of standards. Why is this a thing? And then where are we today and what's coming down the road?
Right. I think the importance of standards is something that, as an engineer, I didn't really appreciate until I became the executive director of OASIS Open, which is where I was prior to joining NVIDIA about 8 months ago. And that experience, even though I had some standards experience when we did the open connectivity framework at Samsung and Intel, it was really the combination of understanding that open source is awesome. I've been an open source engineer or guy pretty much my entire career, but kind of understanding that the pragmatic side of you need to have alternate implementations, and some of those implementations may be open source and some may need to be proprietary. I consider myself an open source pragmatist, right? There's a place for open source in the world and we all love it, and I'm a big proponent of it, but there's a place for proprietary as well, and companies and need to be able to find that balance. And I think that the majority of the work gets done by companies and others in the open source ecosystem, kind of in that mix between proprietary and open source. And so standards to me is a great place to draw a line for interoperability so that you can support those alternate implementations easily.
That's interesting. So where are we today? Again, I know the keynotes this morning touched on a few different topics, four different topics. And, you had a few comments for me afterwards, right?
Yeah.
But it all pertained to, okay, we're here now, but it's going to get really interesting moving forward. So where are we? And then where are we possibly going?
Right. I hesitate to use the word metaverse, right? Everyone likes to use metaverse, and it's the current hype word. It's on its way up in terms of hype, just like cloud was back in the day. But I think what I saw in some of those keynotes is it's awesome the work that's going on in helping web apps be more efficient and do with those kinds of standards. But we're going to get to a point where the 3D web, you can call it the 3D web, call it the metaverse, call it whatever you want, is going to require standardization for how you define 3D assets, how you move 3D assets effectively back and forth between systems. And I think the one thing that has been consistent, if you hear anybody talk about the metaverse, is that it can't be controlled by one entity, right? It has to be open. And I think standards around asset interoperability and around transports and everything else that is going to be required is going to be that next step beyond the things that we heard about in the keynotes.
That's interesting. What advice would you have to anyone listening? Okay, it sounds important. I think I have a much better understanding of it, given your short description there that we started with. What advice do you have to people? Is this something they should focus on from the very beginning? Or should they go educate themselves up? Should they, from an implementation standpoint, should they be really focused on something? Is there a starting point?
Yeah, I mean, I think, standards have been around for a long time, right? And I think standards get a bad name. And it's one of the things that when I was at OASIS, I was trying to help define what we called Standards 2.0 or Standards 3.0. I can't remember now. Because everybody gets the thought of, oh gosh, standards is like the 10-year slog to get something done. The reality is that standards, I think, is adapting to, in some ways, be more like open source, where it's more iterative, but you still also want to take that due diligence and take that time. So I think people should try to educate themselves on what the current process looks like in standards, how it can evolve to be more like open source, and then how you figure out how you blend those two. Because I think that's really going to be the key as we go forward, is people in the open source world look at standards and kind of go, oh, I don't want to be part of that. And people in the standards world look at open source and go, wow, it's the Wild West, right? So I think where people need to kind of focus and educate themselves is on what's the blending of those two, right? And I think that's kind of my, at this point, life's mission, is to help educate both, individuals as well as companies as to what that mix is. And that mix is different for every company, right? So it's kind of figuring out how you do that. But yes, people sort of becoming familiar, if they aren't already, with how the current standards process works, and then thinking about what a more iterative and agile standards development process looks like.
Where might they go to get more education? I know you work for an organization there.
I do. I work for NVIDIA. I think, I'm trying to think sort of how you would do this, right? I mean, there's obviously the existing standards bodies that are out there. I think just kind of thinking through where you potentially go to something like Metaverse Standards Forum, which NVIDIA and a bunch of other folks just started. Just kind of looking at some of the documentation and education stuff that's out there. There's a lot of good standards bodies out there. My former compatriots at OASIS are a great standards body. So anybody who uses SAML today, right? Probably all use SAML. It came from OASIS, right? So I think there's a lot of good documentation and organizations like that.
OASIS, they're actually here this
OASIS
year,
is
right?
here again this year.
The stores there.
They are.
Yeah. Guy, thank you very much. Any parting words? Any parting thoughts?
I just think I would love more people to kind of, again, get that mix of open source and standards. It's a very important thing, and it's something that I really didn't appreciate even as an engineer and someone who did a little bit of standards work, but figuring out how you mix those two is, I think, going to be critical for us going forward. So
I think it's a topic we're going to take a much closer look at in 2023. So as we're putting together the conference and we begin to sort of formulate and bring together content for next year, we'll continue this conversation for sure, because it's something I think I am in complete agreement with you. I think it's super important, and definitely it's going to become increasingly important moving forward for the very reasons that you've identified. So sounds
awesome.
good.
Great.
Yeah. Thanks, Guy.
Thanks, Todd.
You bet.
Good to see you.
Nice to see you.